Welcome everybody to the third of our online talks, our last for the momentous year that has been 2020. Today we're delighted to welcome as today's guest speaker David McCann. David will be known to you as a commentator on local radio, local TV, current affairs programmes. David holds a PhD in North-South Relations from Ulster University. He's delivered several lectures himself at university, and he's deputy editor of online affairs news site Slugger O'Toole. So we're delighted to have David here today. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Marina, who'll talk us through with the format, which just remind us of how the session's going to run. So over to you, Marina.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be, delighted to be here today. What will happen now is that David will give us a presentation, and Marie and I will disappear, and David will show his presentation. He will talk for a while, and then we will ask him some questions at the end. And we'd like to thank schools for submitting questions today. So we have questions from St. Louis Grammar. We have questions from Maherafelt High School, from Carrickfergus Grammar, and from Rathmore Grammar as well. So thanks very much for those questions, and we look forward to asking them. So without further ado, I hand over to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much. Get presentation ready here. Can you all see my presentation? Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks guys for the invite to come along and talk to you today, and thanks to all the schools and for submitting questions. There are a number of them, so we're looking forward to getting to those a bit later. So thanks again. So today I'm going to look at the effectiveness of the executive and the assembly. Okay, and this can always be a wee bit tense, because most people, when they think of governments, do tend to have a low rating of them, particularly when you're in economic tough times or when you are in a bit of a crisis. And Northern Ireland has been there before. I remember a Lucid Talk poll from 2013 in the Belfast Telegraph that had bad news for Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness when it found that just 9% of voters actually approved of the performance of the Stormont executive at that time. And just to put that approval rating in context, that was lower than the Irish government's approval rating at the time of their IMF bailout. The then Cowan government had an approval rating of 14%. It was also lower than the approval rating of the Greek government, who was at 13% during the time of their IMF bailout as well. So we have in the past had very low approval ratings for our executive and our assembly, and you can see why this has happened before. I did a bit of an analysis, a bit of a shameless plug here for Slugger O'Toole, back in late 2015, so 5 years ago, when we were coming up towards the end of the mandate of the 2011 to 2016 Assembly. And I did a bit of a survey about how many bills had been passed during that mandate. And I found out just 34 bills in 4.5 years had been passed by the Assembly. Now, in comparison to their devolved partners, Scotland had passed 64 bills in the same period. And even if you go back to the previous Assembly mandate, which was 2007 to 2011, there were 69 bills passed during that mandate, so less than half. So roughly about half the rate of bills were being passed. And when you looked into what was being debated, what was being approved by Stormont back then, once you took out the housekeeping stuff, things like budget bills and things like, pieces of legislation that just keep the lights on, there wasn't an awful lot to really write home about. There was, of course, Jim Allister's private members bill, Anne's Law, which prohibited the employment of people convicted of terrorist offences as special advisors. But outside of that, there wasn't huge amounts of legislation doing the rounds at Stormont. There was a proliferation of motions, and again, you can see why the public did have that disillusionment. So that's the context in which it's important to put in the debate around the executive in. And of course, when we come back to where we are now, it's important to remember, when did we get devolution back? You may not have noticed, but we didn't have an executive or an assembly for 3 years. So from the end of January 2017 to January 2020, there was no devolved government in Northern Ireland. There was no one essentially from an elected politician sense taking decisions here. Who was governing the place? Well, mostly civil servants. It was the permanent secretaries, people whom neither of us elect, and most of whom probably would never know if we recognized them or if we saw them in the street. And you can see, you can see how that can be problematic, because in a democracy, it should be elected politicians taking these decisions as well. So what led to the end of the 3-year impasse? And again, going back before COVID, it's hard to believe there were political issues before COVID, but there were. If we go back to roughly around about this time last year, we were about to head to the polls. If you can remember, we're in the middle of a general election campaign, which was fantastic. I love elections, and I lament the fact that we haven't had one this year, and we probably won't be having one next year. So I'm looking forward to 2022. But in December 2019, the Westminster general election really was a huge disappointment for both the DUP and Sinn Féin. And why was that? Where did things go wrong for the main parties? Now, for the DUP, they had some really big upsets. So their deputy leader, Nigel Dodds, lost North Belfast, where I'm sitting right now, to Sinn Féin. Emma Pengelly lost South Belfast to Claire Hanna. And also North Down, don't forget, Lady Sylvia Herman wasn't running again, and she was very much emblematic of the Remain voting unionist. And Alex Easton, the DUP candidate, missed out on North Down to Alliance's Stephen Farry. So that was a huge disappointment for them, because I think whilst most people thought that that they would lose South Belfast, that they thought North Belfast would be more competitive than it was, and they also thought that that North Down was almost very winnable for them. So they missed out on those seats, and that was a big disappointment for the parties. And then moving on to that, then you also have Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin, of course, were looking to hold, for example, were looking to hold their Foyle seat, which they lost to Colm Eastwood of the SDLP, and they were also looking to kind of strengthen their position. So, for example, they had swings away from them in 17 of 18 constituencies. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So it was a very disappointing result for the DUP and for Sinn Féin. So in January 2020, this bad election result also coincided with the fact that there was a nurses' strike, which really brought issues around healthcare to the fore. And I don't know if anyone else noticed this, but if you wanted to, and throughout 2019, if you were looking to get an appointment for a doctor, for example, or if you were looking to get some surgeries, for example, scheduled, you very much had a long wait, and these stories were growing in importance. These stories were growing in stature, as you saw people like Mara Louise Connolly, Seanine Graham, and other health correspondents report about waiting times going up and up and up. Some people, for example, were reporting, and I went back and looked through some of the old news reports, some people were reporting between 4 to 5 weeks to just get a basic GP appointment at the time. And what really brought this and give it a public face was the nurses' strike. The nurses' strike, which was a strike about pay, which was a strike about conditions for nurses. So these things were really out there and to the fore, and it fed back into the sense about who could take decisions. And the problem for civil servants who were in charge and who were running the place was that they were limited in the decisions that they could actually make. They weren't able to shift money. They were able to make decisions within existing confines. They weren't able to reallocate money. They weren't able to kind of shift things and create make new policies to deal with some of these issues. So the nurses strike and seeing nurses outside hospitals and seeing nurses ask for fair pay, and you governments the British government very much saying that this was a decision for a devolved administration. So who's going to argue? You think from a PR point of view, who's going to argue with nurses? Who's going to argue with people doing that? And you can see a picture of it there. And this fed this narrative of get back to work. And don't forget, throughout 2019, parties who had a get back to work message did very, very well in the elections. So Alliance really took off. You saw the SDLP gain back strength, whereas the DUP and Sinn Féin really were punished. People were fed up as well. And this fed in very nicely to Julian Smith, who was the then Secretary of State, and Simon Coveney, who still is the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs. This fed into their attempts to get the public to get the government back up and running. And once the Westminster election happened and the nurses combined with the nurses strike, it was a question of if, not when, Stormont came back at that time. So Simon Coveney and Julian Smith brought forward an agreement to the public, and this was a bit of a stroke of genius on their part in terms of PR. What they did was that they hammered out an agreement with the parties, and then they presented it to the public. They didn't bring it to the parties to get sign off. They brought it to the public. So on a very cold Thursday, January night, I remember it very, very well. They brought this agreement and put it out to the public, and they did that for the public to put pressure on the parties, and one after another, they all quickly signed up. Arlene Foster was the first out of the traps, and then the following evening, Sinn Féin followed suit and said that they would sign up and that devolution would return. And the agreement was fantastic because it was a bit like a game show as well. You had Julian Smith and Simon Coveney said, look at all these nice, lovely things you could win if you come back into. And if we get this government back, my goodness, look at all these lovely things around investment and all these big decisions you can take. So, you had all that there. So it was a bit of a stroke of genius, and it did work in breaking the impasse and getting the government back. And a very telling thing about the lack of confidence that the governments had, that they didn't want to leave it, and they wanted to get ministers back as quickly as possible, was the government was reformed on a Saturday. So the agreement was announced on the Thursday night. Sinn Féin and the DUP throughout Friday, and the other parties announced their support for it. They didn't leave it until Monday, and they didn't want to leave it until Monday for a very good reason. They just wanted to get them back. They were worried that something would fall apart over the weekend, and that if the deal was more properly scrutinised, that would be an issue. And we're going to see in a slide's time why they would have been rushing to get them back. So on a Saturday with no fanfare, if you go back and cast your mind back to 2007 and you looked at the fanfare with which devolution was restored then, if you go back to 1999 and look at the fanfare that existed then too, there was nothing like that. People did not cheer. There were no parties. No one was thanking the parties for getting back in. And on a Saturday, they reformed them, and it was I was up in the Great Hall, and it was brilliant to watch because you had the huddle of officials from each department who were standing outside the chamber waiting for their ministers to be appointed. And as soon as the ministers were walked out, their permanent secretaries would take them away, and they all had these binder books, and you could see which departments had the most problems because by the thickness of the files that they had. So you could obviously probably guess the Department of Health. They had many binder books waiting for Robin Swan, and this was all before we heard anything like COVID-19. But being a political commentator, I always like to think what might have been. And it is always worth pondering what might have happened. You can see all the ministers sitting around the executive table there. And one thing that's great about politics and covering it and talking about it is that there are always surprises that are thrown up. Remember, we were talking a lot about mental health and the crisis in the healthcare system in January 2019. So health was going to be one of the last departments that were going to be picked. And everyone expected that the DUP would take health back. That was being well briefed. All the other parties thought that. And everyone expected none other than Mr. Edwin Poots to come in as the Minister for Health. And that was what everyone expected. That was what we all thought. And the other parties who worked the Dáithán process thought that as well. And there was an audible gasp in the chamber when Steve Aiken, the Ulster Unionist leader, stood up and announced that he would be picking health and nominating Robin Swan for it. And it's worth noting, and you can go back, YouTube's fantastic. The Assembly YouTube site has it up. Go look at the faces in the chamber. You can see the audible gasp. You can actually hear the gasps from the other parties when the UUP picked health. Everyone assumed and thought that the UUP would pick agriculture and environment. And you can hear Arlene Foster, who makes the last pick, which was DERA for Edwin Poots, kind of stumbling over her words. That wasn't what she was expecting to nominate him for. She was expecting to make him Minister for Health. So the leader of our COVID response could have been none other than Mr. Edwin Poots. So it's always nice to speculate about what might have been in the executive. And again, I'll leave that up to you about the rights or wrongs, or whether we had a positive or a minus on that. So that's what might have been. So what were the issues facing the new executive? Well, it's the NHS, stupid. Okay, it was healthcare. That was all we were talking about. That's all we talked about for the first 2 to 3 weeks. And again, every journalist was talking about Robin Swan has the worst job in politics. Now, the Department of Health is generally the worst job in politics. For any aspiring politicos out there, if you're a student and you're thinking about getting into politics, if someone walks toward you with the Department of Health and asks you to take on that job, run very far in the opposite direction. It has been the graveyard of many a political career, and it has so many pitfalls. Why is that the case? Because it's the most public-facing public service we have. If you don't have a good time in a hospital, or if you're waiting a long time, you feel that, you see it. And if you're not having that experience yourself, chances are you'll know someone who is having that experience as well. So it was the NHS, stupid. So Stormont knew they had to move quickly on healthcare, and they had to show some progress. So one of the first things out of the gate, and this was agreed within a few days, was the pay deal for nurses. So Robin Swan stood up in the Assembly chamber and was able to talk about and announce a pay deal for nurses. I'll go through that in a wee bit of time. You also had waiting lists as well. Again, I went through earlier about how long some people were waiting for basic operations, and in comparison to the rest of the UK and the South, you can see these issues as well. Then you have mental health as well. We had a real mental health crisis in January, and mental health was getting a big outing. There was talk about maybe appointing a junior minister solely for mental health as well. So again, mental health was a big issue as well. And then also funding New Decade, New Approach. New Decade, New Approach. Remember that agreement that I was telling you that the Secretary of State and the Irish Foreign Minister were holding up, saying, "Oh, look what you could win if you sign up to this." That was funding. Some of the promises in that were a big issue as well. So those are the key issues facing the executive. So you can see there, it's mostly healthcare. That was what we were focusing on in January at that time, and funding some of the priorities there for New Decade, New Approach. Now, successes. There were some successes, and there are some successes of devolution. I know sometimes it can come across that people like me are very critical about devolution, but I will give credit where it's due, and I will always applaud positive decisions. And we would far rather have a devolved government than not have one. So you can see here, £30 million pay deal offered to settle the nurses' dispute, and an apology significantly. And this was the thing, if you talk to any nurses, this was the thing that they actually really appreciated, was an apology from the health minister on the floor of the Assembly that it had to get to that point, that nurses were forced to go out and strike and go out and make their case in that respect. So again, that was it. And you can see here, this was just a few days into the Assembly. You can see Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill and Robin Swan. One of the first things they did was they paid a trip to Ulster Hospital, which is just down the road from Stormont. It's one of the first things they did as a joint official. They listened and they talked away to nurses as well. So Robin Swan was able to get that sorted, and they were able to get that off the table as well. They also set up a working group on mental health, and this is still operating within the executive. So this is to bring together departments, because mental health isn't just the Department of Health. You've got the Department of Communities, who look after things like social housing and issues like that as well. You've got environment as well, because we know spending time outside is positive for your mental health as well. Infrastructure as well is part of that too. Finance and the economy as well. All these things are all part of the mental health challenge. So it's really important that departments work together on it. So the working group is a good coordinating body for that as well. So those were some early successes from devolution, from the restoration of devolution, although there were some issues that existed. So funding the New Decade New Approach. So if you go and look at New Decade New Approach, there are lots of new programs in there and lots of talk about increasing spending. So things like, for example, the McGee campus in Derry, the A5, Narrow Water Bridge. You've got things like, city deal expenditures. You've got new investments in different parts of society. And of course, parties were looking for ways in which to fund this. So parties were looking for around £4 billion for this. That was the figure that was talked about across the parties in January of 2020. It was around about £4 billion extra that they were looking for. And when the agreement was signed and was put in place, the Northern Ireland office come out a few days later with their figures about what they're willing to put forward. They announced a £2 billion package, but when you factored out the existing spending, only £1 billion of that was new money. So for every £4 that they wanted extra, 3 of them were gone. So they only got £1 extra of extra spending that they were looking for, and that of course places strains on your priorities. The executive has to make decisions then about what it will fund and what it will look for. As well. And just to point out, this is £1 billion, I think, over 2 or 3 years. So it only works out at a couple of £100 million. Just to put that in context, the Northern Ireland budget is around about £12 billion every year. So it's not a huge increase year on year. And when protests were made from the parties about this, Julian Smith, the then Secretary of State, was pretty dismissive. He said the executive needs to look at its own revenue, raising measures, as well as coming to the UK Exchequer for cash. So on Twitter, he was very dismissive of the complaints of the Northern Ireland parties. So again, he wasn't very sympathetic to the narrative that they were putting forward. So he said, "Look, this is all you're getting. You're going to have to deal with it." So £1 billion extra when they thought £4 billion was forthcoming. So again, you can see some of the issues. And this leads to debates, of course, about funding and about revenue raising as well. And again, on week one, things start to kind of go off the rails. And again, this led to the charge of New Decade, same approach. So on the Monday, on the Nolan show, Edwin Poots, the new DAERA minister, was on suggesting, he said, look, we may have to look at introducing water charges. And we might have to just look at examining it. And Michelle O'Neill, within about 20 minutes of those comments being uttered, tweeted out that the executive will not be introducing water charges and has no plans to do so. And she was ruling that very firmly out. So that was day 3. Okay, so that was by day 3. This is where things were going. Did it get any better a bit later? Not really. A few days after that, on Inside Politics, the new First Minister, Arlene Foster, was on talking about tuition fees. And she said, we may have to look again at tuition fees, and we may have to look at that as a revenue-raising issue. And she was just saying that may be something that has to be examined. And again, within an hour of that, Sinn Féin had put out a statement. You can see Keith Archibald, the economy spokesperson at the time for Sinn Féin, she was ruling out any rise in tuition fees. And don't forget, Northern Ireland's tuition fees are about £6,000 a year lower than exists over in England. So you can just see here the divisions, and this was all within the first week to 10 days of the executive being reformed. Okay, so you can see New Decade, same approach, and the joys of having a 5-party executive mean that that these issues are all there as well. So this was just in the month of January, and if you look back, little did we know, we were all kind of like, I don't know if any of you ever see like a tsunami, a video of a tsunami coming towards you. If you ever wonder about the tourists who get hypnotized by the tide going out so far, and they're not looking at the big wave coming toward them. That's kind of the way Northern Ireland was in late January and early February. We didn't know this thing called COVID-19 was coming toward us, and how serious it was. Even though COVID-19 had been in China for weeks at that stage, it was very much over there. I remember meeting up with one or two people who I'd be very friendly with who work in the current executive, and this would have been early February, and we were talking about the challenges. We were actually in a packed bar on a Saturday night, sitting on top of each other. And the thing we were talking about was, well, what challenges are coming up? And not one of us mentioned COVID-19, and that was early February of this year. Simpler times. Yet, as you can see from the slide here, about 2 weeks later, the game had changed. On the 27th of February 2020, COVID-19 arrives in Northern Ireland. Our first COVID case is diagnosed. Now, we had known how serious this had been because at that time, Italy starts looking at lockdowns. Spain is starting to get out of control as well. And again, everyone is rushing and trying to see how they deal with this as well. But the executive begins preparing for lockdown. Plans were put in place because they knew that this was going to happen. Once COVID-19 arrived here, it was just going to be a case of how long you could delay it and how long you could push it back. So from that period, the UK and Ireland were very much in a delay phase. That was encouraging people to keep their distance. That was encouraging people to maybe not socialize as much. But this was before any work-at-home orders had been passed or schools had been closed down. So the executive was using this time, as well as other governments, to prepare for lockdown. But who to follow? Who to follow? Because Dublin was doing one thing and the British government were doing others. Don't forget this, at the start of the pandemic, the British government were skeptical about lockdowns. The Johnson government were very much about delaying this, holding off lockdowns for as long as possible, whereas the Irish government were a bit more forward thinking and forward acting. So the Irish government were out front in closing schools. The Irish government were out front in cancelling St. Patrick's Day celebrations and doing things around closing museums and public spaces. And this puts the executive in a bind. Who do they talk? Who do they listen to? You've got Sinn Féin and the SDLP who would naturally look to Dublin. You have the DUP and the Ulster Unionists who would naturally look more to London. So who to follow? Do you go with the government that's being a bit more proactive, or do you go with the government that's doing a bit more wait and see? So there was this divide over that. Now, if you remember the executive, doing these joint press conferences and then literally the messaging falling apart within a day. And the divide really centered around school closures and testing. So on the 16th of March, very early in the morning in Washington, Leo Varadkar announces that all schools in Ireland will close that day and will not reopen. And this puts the executive in a bind because, of course, the public health guidance coming from the UK government and the chief medical officers, we don't need to close schools yet. So the executive, as you know, make a joint appearance and say they're going to keep schools open. However, that doesn't last very long. Michelle O'Neill comes out then the day later and says the schools should close immediately. She backtracks on what was said the day before. And the other issue was testing. Michelle O'Neill gives an interview on BBC Northern Ireland's The View to Mark Carruthers, and she's very critical of the Department of Health and the rollout of testing. She says we need to be testing more. That slogan, test, test, test. And again, the debate over that, because there was a dispute about whether more testing was helpful or not at the time. So that's where the divide really centered on. And of course, you have the bizarre narrative that on the 16th of March, many schools in Northern Ireland act ahead of the executive. We had a natural school holiday anyway on the 17th and 18th of March, and many schools just announced, look, we won't be reopening after the 18th of March. So schools were acting ahead of the executive. Many businesses were acting ahead of the executive. Bars started to close. Shops started to close before the executive passed any rules or regulations asking them to do it. And part of the reason why we got through that first wave so well was actually businesses and people acting ahead. Many places of work. So, for example, any of the people I work with that required office-based learning, that required office-based work, were telling me a few days before anything was announced from the executive, look, we're going to work from home. So you need to get ready for that. So again, businesses were acting ahead of the executive. And then on the 20th of March, once everything gets agreed and gets sorted, the executive announces a full lockdown, and that's when the full measures get passed, and that's when non-essential retail closes. And that's when you see really the full legal effect of fines and COVID regulations coming in here, and you see a unity of purpose around that. So the executive do get it together at that point and do present a unified front. And that's where you start seeing the joint press conferences between Michelle O'Neill and Arlene Foster, and you see joint interview. You see a very jovial relationship between the two of them, actually using each other's first names. They're working well together. The executive ministers are giving joint press conferences. They're using first names. They're working very well together. There seems to be a unity of purpose and a unity of message there as well. And if you go back to my first slide, when I was telling you about the executive only passing 34 bills in 4.5 years, the noteworthy thing was the speed of the decisions. Decisions and new announcements were tumbling out of the executive every day. It was hard for journalists to keep up with the raft of decisions that were being made. So, for example, the executive by the end of March were announcing a sweep of new decisions. New childcare arrangements were put in place for those people who needed it. So basically, schools, for example, we've got a divided education system for the main part here. Not anymore. Schools were being used for childcare facilities. Didn't matter what side of the community you came from. New grant schemes for businesses that were forced to close. Stormont gave most businesses impacted £10,000. They also gave them rates relief as well, to help them get through the COVID-19. New Nightingale hospitals were created, and these were all done within weeks. Hospitals were cleared out, and new COVID specific areas for treatment were put in place. A rollout of a new testing program for coronavirus as well was put in place. New benefit changes around access to universal credit, so they made it easier for you to get access to that as well. Personal protective equipment orders for more than £60 million were put in place. There were some issues around that, around a joint order with the Irish government, but the PPE did arrive, and they were able to do that. The rulebook around procurement was ripped up to speed up decisions. We did things like free transport for public health workers. We did numerous things around the environment as well. And around housing as well. For example, homeless people in Belfast got beds and got places to stay, and that was lauded around the world. Journalists from around the world actually studied Belfast for these decisions that were being made. So this raft of new decisions, and by July 2020, £2 billion of extra funding had been secured and mostly spent in the fight against COVID-19. So again, going back to what I was telling you about earlier, the extra £1 billion that the executive was very disappointed to get. The money did come, but it came to fight COVID-19. So the executive had an immense amount of decisions that were tumbling out of Stormont as well. And it is important to note at this juncture, we've gone from an executive with limited powers to more extensive ones. So the executive has huge amounts of power. The COVID-19 Act that was passed gives the executive a lot of power, gives the government a lot of power. But the Assembly, though, you noticed I've talked all about the executive here. I haven't mentioned very much about the Assembly, because the Assembly has little role in really overseeing these regulations. It has debated them in the chamber, but it is little role in actually overseeing them. The spending power for the executive has dramatically increased. So when all said and done, we're probably looking at around an extra £3 billion of extra expenditure in this year to fight the COVID-19 pandemic in Northern Ireland alone. So the spending power of the executive has been greatly enhanced as well. 5 parties in the executive leaves little space for scrutiny. Okay, so it doesn't really leave a lot of time for nuance there. I mean, although MLAs do stand up and ask questions at question time, ministers still do have to go to committees and things like that. It is blunted somewhat due to that as well. And if you look at things around, like, for example, the Bobby Story funeral, when the Assembly and parties were trying to hold, for example, Michelle O'Neill to account, there are limits on what you can do. And that's just the case generally as well in terms of what ministers can do. Don't forget, holding ministers to account and accountability was a big part of New Decade, New Approach. So again, we have seen some issues around that as well. And those issues of accountability are still very much there. And you can see that on a few different issues in terms of how the Assembly can hold the executive to account. But overall, the executive deals with the first wave effectively, and again, it gets plaudits for how it is dealt with some things. Now, the second wave happens as well. So due to the fallout of the Bobby Story funeral, there is no joint press conferences between Michelle O'Neill and Arlene Foster over the summer months, so July and August and September. Press conferences don't happen. In the meantime, our track and trace system ramps up. So Northern Ireland is one of the first places in the UK to actually have its own COVID track and trace app. And it was argued that our track and trace system was UK leading. It was robust. We heard this a lot as well. But as the economy reopens, cases begin to rise over the summer. And it's not very long until the executive has to start reimposing some more restrictions. So it starts off with Belfast and Ballymena. It prohibits household visits in Belfast and Ballymena. Then Derry follows with even more restrictions, and retail and hospitality has to close in Derry just a few weeks later. And there are arguments that the executive is being too slow to act. There are arguments that the restrictions that they're putting in aren't going far enough. You see epidemiologists making this argument to them, and you see really that there is this notion that our track and trace system may not be as good as we once thought. So, for example, we heard lots of talk from the executive about it being robust and strong, whereas an MLA in Stormont in October made the comment that our track and trace system was about as useful as, quote unquote, a chocolate fire guard. So again, you're saying that the things that were thought to be a strong response to the COVID crisis weren't really as strong as we once thought. And another thing that happens during this time around the executive is the term circuit breaker was introduced into our lexicon as if we needed another to add to lockdowns and testing in COVID-19. The lockdown consensus ends. So 4 parties are still very much on board with this idea about lockdowns being a way in which we should deal with the rise in cases. The DUP depart from this model somewhat in October. So a 4-week circuit breaker lockdown is announced in October, with schools closed for an extra week, and all pubs and hospitality also closing too. Now, the DUP are adamant that this will last for 4 weeks. Arlene Foster makes that statement. Edwin Poots makes that statement as well. The other parties are leaving room for extension. So the other parties in the executive do. But don't forget the wider context here. They were making this lockdown announcement when furlough and other UK government measures to tackle COVID-19 were set to end at the end of October. And this also provokes divided divisions within the executive. You see a period of paralysis where, for example, they have to argue it out. And literally, as this 4-week lockdown is coming to an end, people are arguing. Businesses have no idea what's going on. And literally, you have on a Thursday night, late on a Thursday night, you see a decision being made which doesn't really satisfy anybody, and it doesn't really assuage anyone. And this leads to the bizarre situation of the place reopening for a week essentially, and then it having to reclose down again for another 2 weeks as more measures are announced. And you see that paralysis in the executive as it struggles to kind of get control of a second wave. And again, the track and trace system comes under a lot of scrutiny as well. Enforcement as well. You see the PSNI coming under more scrutiny. You see the Justice Minister coming under more scrutiny about enforcement of COVID regulations and enforcement of things like mask wearing. And that's another thing you saw with the executive, a slowness to really just go to the end destination. So masks, for example, on public transport and in shops and retail, the executive had a message of, look, we are asking you to do this, but we're not going to impose it. And then they end up having to get there anyway. So that was very much a pattern with the executive. But the lockdown consensus, you see more critical statements of lockdown. Edwin Poots, for example, sending an email out speaking about why he doesn't agree with the lockdown restrictions as well. And he's a minister in the executive. So again, you see that consensus kind of ending as well. So where are we today? The executive dominates the governmental process in Northern Ireland. There is no doubt about that. The COVID arrangements and powers given to the executive leave little room for the chamber other than one of debate. Okay, and that's not just new with COVID. That was the case as well over in previous times as well. COVID restrictions, important to note, see less MLAs in the chamber, and this also has an impact. So again, the people in there to ask questions as well. And again, aside from just a few parties that sit in quote unquote the naughty corner, all the other parties sit in the executive, which does blunt the ability to hold it to account as well. Each party kind of takes a role of defending their own ministers rather than holding the executive as a whole to account. And if you look at that during question times, you'll see that too. Jim Allister's bill on improving scrutiny has been debated, but with limited success. So Jim Allister is making a go at trying to get more accountability in there, and you can debate the measures about that, or particularly around special advisors. But this has had limited success. So finally, and to conclude, what have we learned? There are indeed magic money trees at a time of crisis. It's weird for some deficit hawks. We've seen the UK government really put out the public purse when during this crisis, and hundreds of billions of pounds have been spent in the response against COVID-19. And reform can happen in a big way at sometimes. So, for example, we saw our health and education systems hugely reformed and refocused during the COVID-19 pandemic. That was done within 2 to 3 weeks, unprecedented. We saw a huge refocus of government spending as well, and a huge rollout of big programs and big government supports at a devolved level as well. We saw the reshaping of lifestyles as well. I mean, how many of us would have ever thought lockdowns would have been possible in a Western democracy? Can be made in a power sharing government, but that's always going to be limited. Like, they're always going to fight. 5 parties in there, and they're always going to fight. So you need to have that in mind too. The executive will at this stage have less economic firepower to tackle the recession. So the British government are unlikely to give the same amount of fiscal support to the devolved regions as for the recession as they did for the COVID-19 pandemic. And the vaccination program, the vaccine which has arrived, the rollout of that will be key, and the economic recovery of that will be key too. Party discipline going forward, it was interesting. We did see some rebellions against Arlene Foster over the Executive Committee Functions Bill. We saw a number of DUP MLAs abstain on the bill over ministers having decisions over their own departments. Ministerial cohesion is going to be interesting to see how that holds up. Will the SDLP Alliance and the UUP be preparing for opposition running up to the next election? The next election is set for 2022. Hooray! And another one is set, the local elections, for 2023, and the general election is set for 2024. So 2021 will be the last year for a while without an election. So it'd be interesting to see how they use that full year without an election to get things going economically and to get a COVID vaccine program rolled out. So those are the key things I'll be looking out for in 2021. And with that, I will hand it back here, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your questions.
Okay, well, David, thank you very much for that trip over the last year. I was just thinking, obviously, COVID has distorted my sense of time because there was so much you reminded me of, I have to say, that I had forgotten about. Marina mentioned that we had a great haul of questions, kind of grouped them into themes as far as possible. So I'm going to maybe start, David, with the first set of questions. And the theme here is mainly around the structure of the executive and mandatory coalition. So we've one school sending in a question. Due to the collapse of the executive for 3 years and recent divisions in the executive, is it time to think about change as regards how the executive is made up? Another question is, is your view that voluntary coalition should be thought about now, given that it wasn't always written in stone that we should have a mandatory coalition? And then this one has an interesting angle on it as well. It says, given the question, or the person sending the question has a view that they perceive ideological priorities among the 2 main parties, business versus health, and they think, what do you think the impact of a mandatory coalition has been in terms of how the COVID was dealt with, basically?
Okay, so just in terms of how I'll take the last question first. In terms of how a mandatory coalition is impacted on dealing with COVID, well, it's important to look around. So Wales and Scotland have got, well, Wales has got one Liberal Democrat in the Welsh Labour government, but other than that, it's Welsh Labour. The SNP have got a single party government. Their responses to COVID in many respects haven't been any better than ours. So having different parties around the table isn't a barometer of success. So, for example, look at the UK Conservative government. Having Tories and a majority government hasn't always been a route to success. What it does is it can make it slower to get a decision sometimes. So our system's just really messy. Okay, our system, and the problem with our system is that we see everything. There are two things. For all the West Wing fans out there, Leo McGarry had that famous quote in there about two things you never want the public to see: how you make them, laws and sausages. The problem is our parties, and social media is the worst for this. They play it out online. So, for example, you had Edwin Poots going on the radio and saying, well, in nationalist areas, COVID is a bit higher, and then you have and then you get responses to that, and it just polarizes the entire debate. Okay, and you see things like, Caroline Cullen saying spectators shouldn't go to sporting arenas, and then Arlene Foster tweeting out, actually, yes, they can. So it's just very messy, okay? And that's what I would just say. Our system is messier, and we err our agreements way too much in public. I always wonder if Twitter had existed, whether we would have even had a Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So it just makes it harder. Going back to, is a voluntary coalition maybe a better system to go? Well, not now. I just don't think we're there yet. We need to deal with our realities as they are, and I think that voluntary coalition is a long way off. And I think that, look, we are a divided society, and I know there are ways in which you could do a weighted majority. I think we should look at these things. The interesting thing after the next Assembly election will be if Alliance do as well as they're doing, and with the Greens and People for Profit, there would probably be about between 16 to 20 MLAs in the United Community designation. And of course, when it's a cross-community vote, it's unionist nationalist. The United Community designation is kind of sidelined. They are sidelined. It'd be interesting to see if they've got around 20 MLAs, whether that'll be the case next time. So that'll be the next reform, I think, that'll come before voluntary coalition.
Okay, David, thank you. And thanks for those questions. Moving on now a bit to kind of the effectiveness of the executive. We have a question here. Somebody would like your view on what initiatives the executive could implement to improve upon their own effectiveness. And then another question, David, which I think you'll have an interest in given your background in education. Somebody would like you to comment on how the executive has dealt with university students, accommodation, the pandemic, and how it affected that. And also, I know it's another department, but looking at education and the whole area of exams, and somebody making the point, that the Welsh, Scottish and English counterparts in Department of Education have come out with a line on that, and just really kind of your commentary on how the executive has dealt with that.
Okay, so education and particularly higher education, how have things been dealt with? Well, each university has kind of done their own thing. So UU has had a online presence, for example, whereas Queen's brought students back in the first thing. I think they're online now. So I think it's varied from university to university. In terms of students in general, look, I think it's a really hard time, whether you're in secondary school or whether you're in university. There's been so much disruption. I was saying to a student the other day, like, you guys are like the least impacted in terms of health. If one of them got COVID, chances are they would be you'd be okay. But yet, in terms of the disruption, they have been the most impacted, I think. I think in terms of their education, like in terms of their lifestyle. So I don't know, I can't speak for anyone else, but my time in university was great. I loved it. I had so much fun. Like I was out with my friends. I was enjoying it. Great education. I loved it. I had a great time. So I feel sorry for people who are literally stuck in a hall, or they can't go out, or they can't do. I really do, and I really have sympathies for that. So in terms of the disruption, I do think there needs to be more recognition of the sacrifice they're making. It is a real sacrifice, and I think quite often the way it comes across, and I know politicians don't always mean it in this way, but the way it comes across is they kind of wagging their finger at students, like whether it's in secondary schools or in universities, about, oh well, you're to blame for this virus being spread around, and I don't think that's always totally fair. So I would actually be a bit more in terms of students, and I would also look at ways as part of the recovery. How do we also reward students for what they've done? How do we reward students for the disruption that has been there throughout their lives in the past year? So the executive, I think, for 2021 does need to look at that, and whether that's, for example, a bit more support in student finance for people, you reward them in that way, or maybe it's it's something else in that respect. I think that should be looked at. The other question that you had there was about in terms of the effectiveness of the executive. So the executive, I think, has been effective in doling out money. Okay, now I know it can be an easy thing for politicians to do because politicians love spending money. I think that in terms of the effectiveness of the executive, we will actually know their real effectiveness when that money disappears. So a lot of this is one-off spending that has to be spent by April. So if the executive in April is doling back a couple of $100 million to the British government because they take it back, then the effectiveness of the executive obviously isn't that effective if in a pandemic you can't figure out how to spend millions of pounds to support jobs in the economy. So that's a bit of a cop-out to the first question, but you will know it. So my advice would be keep an eye on the January monitoring round, which is coming up. That's when Conor Murphy will take money back from departments if it hasn't been spent, and keep an eye on April when the executive would have to return some money to the Westminster government if it isn't spent. So keep an eye on those two things.
Okay, David. And my final set of questions relate to Brexit. Now, I think it's important to say that we're doing this recording on the 9th of December, and things are literally changing here by the second in terms of how negotiations are panning out. But we have 3 questions here with a Brexit theme. So could you give a view on what the executive's view is on an internal market bill in reference to an Irish border? Do you think Brexit will impact, again, this word, on the effectiveness of the executive? And how much and for how long is Brexit going to impact on the people of Northern Ireland? And do you think a border poll is more likely to happen sooner rather than later?
Oh, Frank, okay, well, okay, a lot of issues in there. In terms of, there isn't an executive position on the internal market bill. There just isn't. And there isn't a joint executive approach on Europe. You've got most of the parties in there wanting to remain and still want to remain in the European Union. You've got 2 parties that are settled on Brexit. So there is no joint thing. Where they do agree on is that Northern Ireland should have the minimum amount of impact. And you can see the DEP have already kind of conceded defeat on the realities of what is going on. So the internal market bill, at the minute, we're saying there'll be a grace period for Northern Ireland supermarkets to bring food in from the rest of the UK with a Northern Ireland only label on it. So another thing we'll see on your berries and on your steaks, you'll see this for sale in Northern Ireland only sticker on it for a few months, and then supermarkets have to reorientate toward Europe. That's going to see a change in what you're seeing in your supermarket shelves as well. So you may be instead of worrying about chlorinated chickens and Argentinian beef, you might just see too much Pinot Grigio, or you might just see a lot more French baguettes on your supermarket shelves. But Brexit, there is no agreed thing, but they are agreed on mitigating the impact on Northern Ireland, and leading into a border poll. I really don't see that happening in the next 2 to 3 years. I really don't. Be interesting to see the next Assembly election. Will there be a trigger for that? So unionism lost their majority in 2017. Will unionism's position shrink further in terms of total number of seats combined? Be looking out for that. That could be something that might trigger it. Can nationalists win over the Alliance Party to a border poll? That's essentially what you need to do. You need to win over the Alliance Party and the Green Party to vote for it and to back it in the Assembly, to maybe call on the Secretary of State to do a border poll. And your other question was on
Oh yes. Do you think Brexit will impact on the effectiveness of the executive?
Well, in some ways, it'll actually give more power back to the exec because the British government, now whether they follow through with this is another thing. But a lot of the powers coming back from Europe around agriculture and things like that, they're meant to go to Stormont, so they're meant to go back to Westminster and then come back to us. So they may actually end up having more power, and we actually do have a lot of power. The Assembly votes on what regulations it wants to align with in Europe. So that's actually a good point about the Assembly and the effectiveness of the executive. So it will actually have some more power around that. So the executive will have much more control over charting our future with Europe and our relationship with Europe. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave that open for debate. But the executive will have much more of a role in Europe. I would imagine we would see Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill take more flights to Brussels, which ironically they would have to go through Dublin Airport to do at this stage. I'd imagine you'll see the executive ministers spending more time in Brussels than you've seen in the past. So yeah, it's going to become much more important, and it kind of makes you wonder what the last 4.5 years were all about.
David, a great set of questions from our students and teachers, and thank you very much for your responses. And I'll hand over to Marina, who has another set.
Yes, David, you're not finished yet. Have a mouthful of coffee there, draw breath. And I've got a few questions for you once again around COVID, which you have you've covered extensively, but a couple of interesting questions there. And also around, some issues that really concern the people of Northern Ireland, and questions around, are the parties listening really to the people on those issues? And also then maybe a final, I suppose, a summary again of how well we're doing in relation to the recent agreements and implementing those, and also the greatest achievements, the greatest hits, and then what kind of stands out for you in terms of what could have been done better. Okay, so starting off with then, overall then, how do you think the executive, apologies there, everyone. How effectively do you think the executive dealt with COVID? Would things have been significantly different if Stormont had not been restored? So that's one. And let me see what else we have on COVID. Do you think the executive will make vaccines compulsory? And do you think the pandemic has brought the executive closer in any way and has made them more effective?
Okay. Thank you very much for those questions. Do I think the executive will make vaccines compulsory? Robin Swan has been clear in saying that no, they won't. What could be an issue there? I mean, we've seen Qantas, for example, the national carrier of Australia, say that they will not take anyone who does not take the COVID vaccine. And many countries actually already have a policy of you need to have certain vaccines before you go into them anyway. So a lot of them have had this anyway. So what that might do for anyone not thinking about taking it, it may impact where you can go on holiday. And that's a country decision. So it'll be voluntary, but it may impact where you want to go when your hollybobs. So you may want to think about that as well. In terms of the executive coming closer together, it did in the first wave. But in the second wave, that all kind of just fell apart. So you had the cross, and a good example, and this goes back to some of the questions Anne Marie was posing about mandatory coalitions. You saw the cross community veto being deployed over COVID regulations. So you had the DUP deploying a cross community mechanism to veto proposals from a Ulster Unionist health minister. So you can see where mechanisms like that have been used. It hasn't always brought them together. I mean, they go through peaks and troughs. One day, if you're talking to people who are working, I'd be quite friendly with people in different parties who sit around the executive, and you talk to them one week and you're going, oh yeah, things are getting back on track. Don't worry, we're all okay. You talk to them the next week, they're head in their hands and they're just trying to work in this environment is difficult, so 5 parties, like, it's messy. You've also got big personalities around that table. Don't forget this. Like, imagine being in a boardroom with Naomi Long, big personality. Arlene Foster's a big personality. Michelle O'Neill, Edwin Poots, Conor Murphy. They're big personalities. Can you imagine trying to get an agreement between that group of people? It is very, very difficult. And Carney Cullen as well, big personalities. So again, trying to get a decision between those personalities too. So I think in terms of that, there it has brought it did in the first wave, but that has dissipated somewhat. And it'll be interesting to see how they handle the recovery and the vaccine rollout. Actually, well, the vaccine rollout, you would imagine that'd be pretty unanimous. You would imagine, anyway. We'll wait and see. There may be some consensus breaking down over that in the months to come, but hopefully not.
Okay, and actually, you said that key to future success would be the handling of the rollout of the vaccine, but also how economic recovery
Yes.
would be managed. What is your view on what the financial consequences for Northern Ireland will be after this pandemic? And just a final one linked, it's kind of about the Ulster Unionist Party. And it's basically, do you envisage any reward for the UUP for taking on health, which you referred to? And also for Robin Swan's performance as minister?
Okay, so I'll take on the UUP first. Health's a weird department. This is the reason why I tell any aspiring politicos don't go near it. A former Irish health minister famously dubbed their Department of Health as Angola after his time in it, and it's just the worst department. Why? Because the Ulster Unionists are not set, it looks at the minute, to get any reward from it. If you take a look at a recent poll that was done, there doesn't seem to be very much reward coming for them. The Ulster Unionists, if I was putting my betting hat on, will be set to probably lose a seat or two at the next Assembly election. So Robin Swan, I think, has a lot of personal regard, but that's great. Robin Swan, if he was on the ballot in 18 constituencies, that would be fantastic, but he's not. He's only in the ballot in one. So you'll probably get a reward in North Antrim because he's seen as a very decent, straightforward guy. But however, if the vaccine gets rolled out, and this is the other thing about voters, we've got short memories. We tend to vote on the there and the then and the things that are going wrong. So if COVID and the vaccine's been rolled out and we vote in May 2021, you're probably going to be voting more likely on the health waiting list, which due to COVID are going to be worse. They are worse now. They are dramatically worse now. So that operation, I don't know if any I've had one or two family members who've had their operations delayed 3 or 4 times. We're in a pandemic, so you have to understand that. But those people are going to be voting on whether they got those operations. Those people are going to be voting on your GP appointment. They're going to be voting on those things. So Robin will probably get tagged and probably get a lot of criticism for that as well. His performance as health minister, look, Robin's a very nice guy. He's a very nice man. And he's a very straightforward guy. He's very hard not to like. He's very, very hard not to like, which is great for a health minister. And during the early days of the pandemic, he almost had that North Antrim sturdiness, like this tsunami coming toward him, and he was just so calm, so thing, and that's what you want in a crisis. But whether the UUP are preparing for opposition at that point, because don't forget the parties are going to be asked questions about will you rejoin an executive by the next election, that it will be a key thing. So again, Robin may be either leading the charge out of the executive or trying to defend his record in it. The other one is about the financial consequences. Well, I was saying during the thing that the price tag for Northern Ireland is probably going to come to about £3 billion. The interesting thing is we've got the furlough scheme, we've got all these government schemes that are propping up loads of jobs. Those will come to an end at some point, and that's when the rubber will hit the road in terms of unemployment. That's when the rubber will hit the road in terms of businesses, when those grants and the things are taken away. Once a vaccine's rolled out, the government are going to start doing that. They're not going to keep furlough in for forever, and that'll be the key thing. And how the Northern Ireland Executive deals with that will be important. Whilst, don't forget this, the Northern Ireland Executive will be doing that whilst reorientating Northern Ireland's economy from where it is at the minute towards the new regulations that it will have with the European Union. So the executive has got a big balancing act as well there to do. So Northern Ireland's got two things. So we've actually got double the problems of any other region. So whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll see.
Okay, thank you, David. And the issue raised really by one of the schools is mental health. Mm-hmm. And the school has said that it appeared to be a priority for all parties during the last election campaign. yet there appears to be no substantive action proposed to deal with the crisis. Now, you did mention, of course, the working group on mental health, but you also said that there was talk of a junior minister with responsibility for mental health, which hasn't happened. And the school wants to know, what do you think we can do to ensure that our politicians, do listen on these issues, these important issues which impact us all, really?
Okay, I was actually talking about this with a couple of schools fairly recently, actually, about mental health. It is a huge issue. And we shouldn't underestimate the impact that COVID has had on that as well, the disruption, the change in lifestyle, not just for peoples, but for everyone. I think everyone, if they're being honest with themselves, has had a testing time in the past 7 to 8 months. I certainly have. It's tough, but how to keep that on the agenda is very simple. I've seen loads of bodies being set up. So I know there's SSUNI, which is the Secondary School Students' Union, which is fantastic. I know there's a new charity called Pure Mental, for example, which has been set up. So doing things like that and just keep lobbying the executive. The great thing now is that they've got an education minister, they've got a health minister, they've got a communities minister. They can actually go and lobby. So my advice would be just to keep doing that and just keep raising it as well. People in that age cohort are great on social media. I would do that, but I would also make it about changing the conversation on mental health. I often think our mental health system's back to front. Our mental health system will intervene when you have the problem. But for me, I think it's about stopping the problem from occurring in the first place. And there are loads of countries that do that very, very well. And that goes back to better jobs, better sense of well-being, better adjusted kind of environments as well. So I think there are a lot of other things around that we can do a bit better. But my advice to them is, and it's not just with mental health, it's with any issue you want. Just keep lobbying them and email them, tweet them, write them, and keep at them. Just keep banging their door down. If I didn't bang down politicians' doors, Slugger would never publish an article. Let's put it that way. As politicians, you just need to keep at them. You just keep at them, and keep going with it, and don't get too disheartened. So.
Okay, and we're well into extra time here, but this is definitely the last area, and it again goes back to something that you have covered at length, which is kind of a progress report on the executive's implementation of Stormont House agreements, the original and the Fresh Start agreement, and New Decade, New Approach agreement. So what's your I suppose your summary assessment of that, and also, what in your view, David, have been the executive and assembly's main successes and failings?
Okay, so the agreements. So let's do with Stormont House and Fresh. So we saw recently on legacy, we are no further advanced than we were then. And I remember when I was there when Stormont House was announced at the press conference, and I remember this was being heralded along with Fresh Start, which came. They were a few months apart, and I remember these being heralded as some great leaps forward, and very little has actually happened on them, particularly on legacy. We're still no further forward. That's not entirely the Northern Ireland Party's fault, by the way. The British government's got a role in that. The Irish government's got a role in that. So in fairness to them, it's not entirely their fault. So on that, in terms of New Decade, New Approach, well, I mean, politicians will tell you, well, look, we had a pandemic like 6 weeks in, which is fair enough. Okay, I'll give them that. So we're not hugely far along on New Decade, New Approach. Now, whether a lot of this gets mothballed, it'll be interesting to see. If it's like any of the other agreements, then yeah, a lot of Stormont House won't see the light of day. Sorry, a lot of New Decade, New Approach won't see the light of day. I know next year we're getting the identity body set up, and I know that's been confirmed. Michelle O'Neill confirmed that in question time last week. So I know things like that are being done, and that language provisions all come into. So I know that. So in terms of aspects of the agreements around legacy, I don't think we're any further advanced. In terms of an overall executive kind of performance, 11 months in to it, I would have the year and say first wave, first bit, I would give them a B+. Okay, B+. They weren't perfect at the start. There were jitters, so they would have got an A. So I'll give them a B+. The second wave, oh jeepers, I'll give them a C-. They pulled, but to be honest with you, businesses having to log on to Twitter to find out what was going on and like having to resort to tweeting ministers, I just think is a ridiculous situation to be in. So communication, I think, is a big thing. So that's something that that I think they need to get better at. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, David, for answering all of those questions and for giving us such an interesting insight, and you've packed so much into that presentation. I don't know about you, Anne-Marie, I can't wait to get it out there on the website for teachers and students
very much
to
so.
see and to absorb, and either the good news or bad news for you is you'll definitely be invited back. So,
Love to. You had a blast. It was a great way to spend the morning. So.
That's fantastic. Anne-Marie, hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Marina, and totally, David, I echo Marina's words. Really, it'll be so valuable, and it was great for me to listen to and get all the reminders, actually. And yeah, I know anyway that you're at your happiest when you're observing an election. So I wasn't surprised to hear all the references to past and even future election predictions. So definitely very brave. David, I would like to end on a note. You've been on the two sides of a desk in education, and I would like to give the final word to you. Our audience out there will mainly be teachers and students, and what would your advice to them be in terms of things to watch out for, or websites to go to, or podcasts, or whatever, just okay. To end off.
Okay, so great online resources if you're going to spend your Christmas break looking it up. Of course, I would just say, this is the shameless plug. I would say sluggerophil.com, of course, is the best one to go to. But outside of that, there are others. In terms of good things to go to, I think we've got fantastic websites. For example, the newspaper websites in Northern Ireland, I think, are very, very good. It is well worth your while getting a subscription for Christmas. And again, great Christmas present for all your nerds out there. Get your mom or your dad or something to get you a subscription to a newspaper, whether it's the Belfast Telegraph, the newsletter, or the Irish News. Again, if we don't pay for our journalists, we're going to end up losing them. And we've got some fantastic journalists in Northern Ireland. So I would get a newspaper subscription for Christmas. I think that in terms of a good resource, I would just there's so many great podcasts online. It's hard to actually name many of them, but there are so many great things on YouTube for American politics. The Washington Post has a great podcast called Presidential, for example. It takes every president in turn and goes through their legacy. That's free on YouTube. There's so many great podcasts about like For the Many, which is on LBC, presented by Ian Dale and former Home Secretary Jackie Smith, about British politics. So there's so many great things out there. So I would advise lots of podcasts. I'd get on to Spotify, type in British politics, Irish politics, or Northern Ireland politics, and get listening. And again, I would just look at all the great online resources, and taking out a newspaper subscription would be the other thing. And the other thing is, I would just end on this note as well. In terms of online resource and in terms of getting through the muddy waters of education in the next few months, is just be patient with yourselves and be patient with your teachers, and just know, thankfully, that we're in the home stretch of this, and that this is all going to come to an end very soon. So just be patient for the next few months, and just know, look, hopefully we'll have a great summer. And hopefully by the time you either start university in September, or you're getting back into your new school year next September, hopefully we'll be back to some form of normality. So this won't last forever.
David, nice optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much on behalf of Marina and myself, the Education Service.